Great. That's excellent. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Miles, especially for being here as well. Welcome to our Latin American Studies speaker series. Our first one of the fall, correct? Yes, first one of the fall or the spring. My name is Jessica Craig. I'm Latin American Studies and Anthropology faculty at CNM. And we collaborate with UNM on a number of things, but among them the speaker series. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about Latin American Studies at CNM. It's a pretty exciting, new but robust little program. We've got an intro course and a really great and popular film class. And I think most exciting, especially right now, is a study abroad program to Guatemala, which will expand, we think, to other places in Latin America. But we will be taking 10 or perhaps 12 CNM students to Antigua, Guatemala, and locations nearby for just a short 9-day trip in August. And it's the second time we've done it. We were supposed to do it in 2020, and of course that didn't work out. So we're pretty excited to go, but to be able to offer that to CNM students, a study abroad experience that's feasible in terms of time and finances. And so that's an exciting part of Latin American Studies at CNN. And so what I'll do, I'm going to hand it over to Kelsey Varisco to talk more broadly about our partnership and about the work we do and the grant that we're under. And then I will come back and introduce our speaker and talk about the structure of the talk a little bit. Kelsey.
Thanks, Jessica. Thanks, everybody, for being here. It's great to see you. And thank you so much, Miles, for speaking. I was lucky enough to have class with Miles, and he's a friend of mine. So I'm really glad to have him with us today. But I just wanted to take a couple minutes to let you all know that CNM and UNM have received a grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. And it is a grant to help transfer students from CNM or from other community colleges come over to UNM in the humanities. And so there are a handful of graduate students that are there to serve as mentors, to answer questions, to talk about their areas of study. And then there's also an opportunity to do a summer academy, which would be taking 1 or 2 summer classes that would give you credit at CNM and at UNM. And then the different departments are also hosting talks, panels, and different tabling events at CNM or at UNM and at the branch campuses to work with students who are interested in transfer and want to know what resources are there for them. So I can add my email to the chat. The website is under construction right now, but this is the Extending Humanities Pathways Grant, New Mexico Humanities Now. So if that's helpful for anyone, please reach out to me. And otherwise, thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, Miles.
Awesome. Thank you, Kelsey. So in terms of the talk, we're going to hand it over to Miles. We're super excited to hear what you have to say, Miles. Your research is amazing, fascinating. I can't wait. But if you have questions, which we hope you do, of course, we do want to wait until the end, if that's okay, but feel free to put them in the chat as you think of them, because sometimes that works better for my brain. And I'd be happy to read them for you at the end, or if you want to go ahead and read them yourself, that's fine. But we will save questions for the end. And then the other thing, we have just a quick survey about this series, about the lecture series, what we could do, or you have suggestions or ideas for talks. So we'd love if you take a minute. Lenny Orena Valerio is going to put that link in the chat. And so at some point during the talk, or even better at the end, if you could take a few minutes and do that survey for us, we'd be super grateful. So, okay, so without further ado, let me introduce Miles. Thank you again, Miles. Miles Nolan has been engaged in affordable housing work for over a decade, focusing on participatory development and collective land tenure practices. His drive for this work stems from his housing advocacy and community development work in Shelton, Washington, where he coordinated social services for homeless families and children and helped develop increased services for immigrant families and homeless teens. Miles co-founded the Mason County Host Program, a housing education program for homeless teens based in schools that supported them in securing housing diplomas and work. He worked as a housing cooperative developer with the Northwest Cooperative Development Center, the NWCDC in Olympia, Washington, where he led resident homeowners through the purchase and conversion of 5 resident-owned manufactured housing co-ops. He continues to do state policy work at the NWCDC, advocating for legislation and state dollars to bolster co-op development. Miles recently completed his MA in Latin American Studies. Congratulations, Miles, with a concentration in environmental governance at UNM, where his research centered on community control and immigrant-led housing co-ops in the US and the Caño Martín Peña Community Land Trust in Puerto Rico. So I will hand it over. Thank you again, Miles. We look forward to it.
Great. Thanks so much, Lenny and Jessica and Kelsey, for having me today. And thanks for everyone for showing up for this first presentation that I've done on my research today. I'm going to share my screen. Yeah, so my name is Miles Melvin. Thank you so much for the introduction. Yeah, I guess I came to the Latin American Studies program first just to I guess continue to do research in areas of community development where I thought the geography of Latin America offered a lot of learning opportunity around how communities have traditionally been practicing collective land tenure, either indigenous communities or peasant communities. And also the fact that there's just a really rich history of territorial land-based struggles in Latin America, as well as other forms of solidarity economy work, cooperative development work, and other forms of worker ownership and collective land tenure. So that drew me to the geography. My work as a housing co-op developer across Washington state, where I worked broadly with both poor and working class white folks, as far working across race and language and politics with working and migrants, Latino folks, was like a really rich experience for me that really brought my heart into this work of looking for ways to protect shared land tenure. But it also taught me about some of the flaws in some of the development models where community control was compromised to the powers of often lenders or bureaucracies, or the need for kind of fast-paced development. So that led me to this research that I'm going to present to you today, which is called Land-Based Organizing in Caño Martín Peña Community Land Trust, San Juan, Puerto Rico, a community control model for informal settlements in Latin America and beyond. So I want to start by introducing the community land trust model for those of you who aren't familiar with it. Community land trusts are land-based developments that are commonly run by nonprofits with the intention to preserve and protect land and promote them as community controlled. And I'll quote John E. Davis, who is a very well-known prolific scholar in the community land trust world. He's the editor of the Community Land Trust Reader and a really great book called On Common Ground about international struggles for community land trusts. And that community land trust, or CLT, is a strategy for redistribution, putting property and power into the hands of people deprived of both. It is also a bulwark against loss, protecting hard-won gains in ownership and empowerment from leaking away over time. So some key concepts are the concept of trust, which indicates practices in land stewardship, or it's often referred to as trusteeship, which I want to just recognize that commonly held land for the purpose of the common good is something that is historically relevant across the globe, amidst many cultures, particularly indigenous cultures and in Black traditions, both here in the US and Latin America and historically and in Africa. And so what scholars have noticed is that as the trust work has moved forward, this idea of stewardship has more and more gone to the wayside with the rise of global capital. Community was entered into this language sometime in the mid-20th century, and it implies an element of community control, both locally inside the community, those who are served by the trust, and also those sometimes outside of the community through solidarity relationships to support the bolstering of land access to those traditionally excluded and reaching those folks more broadly. Land is owned in a trust, so it's separated from the built environment. That built environment could be homes, and those homes could be rented or could be owned by families, so single family homes. Cooperative housing could also be that built environment, or multi-uses like organizing space or gardens could also be that built environment. And that's an economic understanding that land value increases based on the built environment surrounding it or on it. And so by separating the two, having the land held by the trust, you can protect it and from redevelopment, but also make sure that it remains affordable. It decommodifies land, protects it from market speculation, and promotes can promote permanent housing affordability, as well as community control via land board makeup, control over land use, and different layers of democratic function within the resident-based organization. And boards are commonly made up of a mix of land beneficiaries, including residents, but sometimes surrounding residents and external stakeholders. So the Caño Martín Peña Community Land Trust is located in the heart of San Juan, Puerto Rico. It piqued my interest because it is a grassroots social movement that demonstrated a very complex and sophisticated form of community organizing and community control that has surfaced as an inspirational model for other communities, specifically informal settlements across the global South. So it's a transformational organizing practice, which I'll talk a little bit to later, that embodies participatory planning, so grassroots planning. It's made up of 7 community assemblies. These are the 7 communities, as you can see right here with the Caño, or the canal, going through the center. And at the head of those 7 community assemblies is an organization called the G8, which is kind of the mother organization. And there are 12 participating organizations that are members of the G8. It has a rich history of shared struggle, the broader community does, for land permanence and commonly shared benefit. It was settled in the early 30s, in the 30s and 40s, when peasants arrived from the rural areas of Puerto Rico and other places around the Caribbean during the rise of industrialization. Their history is also rich in resistance to slum eradication and later in the century, urban renewal that pushed people out and expropriated communities, and the more current theme of gentrification in the neoliberal era. In the early 2000s, the community came together with the support of external professional organizers whom helped facilitate over 700 meetings street by street to help form consensus around the idea of creating a community land trust and figuring out a way to clean up the canal, which has been historically polluted and contaminated. They helped fight and win the passage of Law 489, which formed the Enlace Corporation, which is a state-affiliated nonprofit that was charged with helping build the development plan and facilitate participatory planning. And the Community Land Trust, which acquired over time 200 acres of city land to be preserved for the purpose of the development and maintenance of affordable housing. The law did not build in adequate funding for the entire project. Enlace was empowered for 20 years to help do some of that fundraising. But through both professional support and community organizing, the community has raised adequate funds as of recently, 18 years later, to complete the dredging project of the canal, but continues to struggle to raise funds for the remainder of the development project. So why research El Caño Martín Peña Community Land Trust? Well, life in informal settlements is getting less and less stable. One of the theories I reflected on in my research was accumulation by dispossession. So the idea that for capital to continue to grow, it needs to find new creative locations to expand surplus. And more that's happening in urban spaces, and we see it in cities across the world through gentrifying practices that prioritize private development and push out working, poor, and BIPOC people. Like I said before, its movement is broadly influential on the international on an international scale, and is being looked to as a model, particularly considering the fact that it's the first community land trust to form out of an informal settlement in Latin America. The land-based grassroots organizing model is unique in that it stems from generations of understandings and knowledge drawn from locals who originally settled there over decades, and the unique legal structure of community land trusts to thwart off predatory capital gentrification. And it has done a pretty significant and impressive job at promoting community control over valuable land through practices like self-governance and participatory planning. And later in the presentation, I'll talk a little bit about how it is utilizing solidarity work and internationalism to promote its model and not work in isolation, but work at transforming and imagining new societies outside of predatory capitalist development practices. I forgot I'm supposed to introduce these images. This is a photo that I took during my 2.5 weeks down there in Puerto Rico. This is a participatory planning meeting with 2 of the 7 neighborhoods where folks are giving feedback on the master development plan where it stands today. And that was in June of 2022. So I had pre-field research questions that I formulated before I went down there, which mostly surfaced from my archival work, where I looked through 10 years of community newspapers and saw that there was a lot of discussion about reflections on land and water and the history of settlement in the area. And that was something that almost every newspaper pointed to on at least a few pages. And then I had post-research questions that surfaced after I'd done more research on community land trusts and community control. So my pre-field research questions were: how have land-based epistemology rooted in the community Caño, Martín, Peña struggle for land permanency, land tenure, and environmental justice impacted the social movement's community organizing practices? And how are these land-based knowledge formations and community organizing practices evolved across generations? And then my post-field research question was: how does community control over land function in the Caño, Martín, Peña social movement? And do land-based organizing practices bolster community control? I'll follow up by discussing some definitions around those questions. I'll go back really quick because I forgot to introduce this photo. This photo was from a community meeting that was not participatory. It was informational about the development plan maritime zone project, which affects the folks that are living along the canal's borders, and includes a project that will relocate eventually a total of 500 homes, where those people being relocated will have an option to live in a community land trust home. So land-based epistemology, I defined as knowledge formations, often shared, rooting from how locals understand and interact with land. Community control is a bit more complicated, and I'm still I'm doing more research on the concepts of community control as it relates to the community land trust movement. So there's a lack of academic consensus on a definition, and there's many factors and arguments that weigh in. But in the community land trust movement, it's important to recognize that it has deep roots, going back to theorists like Henry George, who understood this concept of separating land from the built environment, and Robert Swan, who worked alongside Slater King during the post-civil rights desegregation moment in the United States to develop the first community land trust, which was called New Communities, that was created in 1969 and went into trust in 1970 in Albany, Georgia, protecting 3,000 acres for Black sharecroppers who were traditionally and continuing to be violently excluded from land ownership through white supremacy organizations like the KKK. New Communities stems from a concept of community control that embodies the Black radical tradition, and speaking to how land can be used for human value or use value, versus how land under racial capitalism is used for the purpose of commodification and its exchange value on the free market. So this first community land trust also embodied a fortified community control through through empowering the local residents who benefited from the land, but also external solidarity relationships with other sometimes out-of-state civil rights organizations, understanding that that kind of solidarity was needed to build political power to thwart off violent racist attempts at shutting down the community land trust during the violent climate of the desegregated South. So speaking to how community control has evolved in the current neoliberal era, Phillips and Williams classify it in regard to levels of local autonomy where local control exists over land, capital, and assets, including how land use decisions are made, and also considering how common ownership of land and resources can be used to fend off threats of global capital and make sure that historically marginalized populations have access to land and land-based decisions. Community control can be sourced through grassroots community organizing, board makeup, like I spoke to earlier, local democratic functions and the different layers that might exist, whether it's a co-op or whether it's like at Caño, Martín, Peña, a number of neighborhood associations or even youth groups. And then, how solidarity can function to support community control versus political favoritism and other ways that external power brokers have come to more and more quash efforts in community control, which I'll speak to in a later slide. And it's solidified by critical and political consciousness among the local residents who benefit from the land and their ability to gain political power and challenge capital in transformative and what Ruth Wilson Ginsburg would refer to as non-reformist reform ways. So speaking more to community control, in the CLT and the community land trust movement over time, community control is being compromised, particularly with the rise of neoliberalism, austerity, and the professionalization of community land trusts. There's more of a focus on professional fundraising, and that effort and work is replacing the efforts of community organizing. Funder red tape. Anybody who's ever worked with a federal housing grant will know how cumbersome that is and how much those are designed for professionals, sometimes full-time professionals, just to monitor and distribute one federal grant, as well as the political power and hierarchy inherent in foundation dollars. Communities do need capital. This is real, and at the same time, political power can be shifted, and so it's important to look for ways that community land trusts can break through boundaries and build transformative economic and radical restructurings of how our economic systems function. And then scholars like John E. Davis ask, well, what is kind of the sweet spot? What is that place where access to capital can still happen, understanding that it comes from these kind of cumbersome grants and foundations, but still building in that political consciousness, mobilization, and common stewardship to maintain and bolster community control. So my methods were qualitative, and I focused on storytelling and oral histories. Again, I noticed that was a big theme in the archives that I originally analyzed before my trip, and understood that, according to scholars like Gons, storytelling is critical to social movement designs and fabric. and how they build broad membership bases and political power. So I did 11 semi-structured interviews with local leaders. Some of those were professional and some of those were volunteers from the community. But yeah, I believe the majority of them, 9 or so, were locals from the movement. I also interviewed folks from 2 different generations. So a senior group of leaders who'd been involved in the movement for a longer period of time since its inception, and then a younger group of community volunteers who had grown up through their critical pedagogy program. I talked about the newspapers, and then participant observation were community meetings that I observed. And this is my table at the Airbnb where I stayed, full of cameras and different equipment that I was shuffling around and reviewing every day after a busy day of interviewing. So I'm going to try to move a little quickly. There's a lot of theory that I dove into, but I wanted to highlight two concepts that I worked with to bounce off my findings, which were the concepts of enclosures of the commons, and then what Federici refers to as the new urban enclosures, as a way to understand how community land trusts coming out of informal settlements, bolstered by community organizing, can act to reclaim common spaces. And commons refers to either the commons of pre-capitalist feudal Europe, but also of traditional Native American or indigenous lands where land is held in common and used to promote resources for things like social reproductive labor. When I talk about social reproductive labor, I'm speaking about the work of people making and raising children and caretaking elders, which is, according to Katz, at its most basic, hinges upon the biological reproduction of the labor force, but both generally and on a daily basis. And in my research of social reproductive labor, it arose that for centuries capitalism has been pushing back on paying the bill for social reproductive labor. And so, an example of this is the enclosure of the original commons where women traditionally used lands to garden and to draw medicine for midwifery practices, etc., to the current day where capital and private enterprise is pushing back on our ability to have free healthcare and quality education and childcare for all, and then pushing that cost back onto the social reproductive work of mostly women. So in the end, poor families, mostly women, are the ones subsidizing capitalism's workforce. And so then I jumped to, well, what are the new urban enclosures? So when we talk about urban spaces, which often include common areas, places for working people to live and meet, Federici talks about the new enclosures as being shut down and propel, and this shutting down these enclosures being sped up through the world of global debt that we've observed, particularly in the neoliberal area, which is often very authoritarian, where groups like the IMF and World Bank are essentially holding people in the global South hostage to debt servicing in order to bolster development and shift economic interests. And this comes along with increased privatization, austerity, and the perpetual divestment of the state in social reproductive work. So I'll speak a little bit more about debt economies later on, but I did want to introduce some of these concepts. Also, when we talk about reclaiming, we're talking about doing so through commonly held land for common good, controlled from the grassroots to bolster resources towards social reproductive work, but also reclaiming as a transformative approach that imagines and builds a world beyond capitalism, racial capitalism, and the fundamental political and economic systems that exploit working people, the global working class, and divide up those at the bottom. I also looked at community organizing theory and investigated intergenerational practices that invest more in education, empowerment, and bolster youth leadership, but also work across senior and youth generations to draw in member participation and also plan for succession for leadership in the future. And then I looked at ways that transformative community organizing is broadly feminist, in that it bolsters relationships of solidarity and trust, and builds solidarity through small, intimate meeting spaces where locals can gain leadership, such as meetings in the street or in the basketball courts, and the community councils embraced by Caño, Martín, Peña. Local leaders are also empowered to penetrate and traverse the boundaries between the private and public spheres to confront external power brokers. What I mean by public and private spheres are often thought of as the home and maybe extending into the schools, but public spheres are traditionally in under current capitalist economic state, usually dominated by white male business-minded folk and politicians. So encouraging and promoting the breaking down of those barriers. And again, focusing on securing reproductive security. And to the right, I have a quote that is printed in every, on the front page of every community newspaper, which is the Raíces del Caño community newspaper. And I think it embodies the transformative intergenerational feminist community organizing practice of Caño, Martín, Peña quite well. Like a good tree, the roots symbolize the base, the union of our efforts growing through the decades of the communities of Caño, Martín, Peña. Through their continued struggle, the residents of these communities have managed to stay and aspire to socially transform the environment and the country. So I looked, in my findings, I looked through archives, including an oral histories collection that spoke broadly to the decades of struggle against the eradication of, quote, slums or informal settlements. Slums, of course, is a derogatory framing of informal settlements that casts them as insanitary and blight. This is a quote from one of these oral history archives, what those people, Department of Health affiliates, did was on Sundays when residents were at home, they brought prison inmates in and knocked down the houses. They took the boards and cut them up. You couldn't use them. So these stories of auto construction where residents would help build the homes that you see here in the picture along the canal were stories that were broadly shared from the senior leaders that I spoke with. Along those lines, a community leader shared with me, once someone arrived from the country, everyone helped to build the houses, and they had to do it at night because if they did it during the day, the police would knock it down. So there are all these stories that one has been listening to since childhood. I also heard a lot of the senior leaders discuss their connection to water and what the water was like and used to be like. They used to swim in it and you could fish in it. And these are just very common stories when bringing up oral histories with senior leaders, and also stories that were commonly shared in the Raíces del Caño newspaper. The younger generation also spoke to water, but more in the context of the unhealthy and perpetual flooding that they often endured. For example, walking to and from school. So the other piece of land-based knowledge that I was observing while I was down there was stories about people's adjacency over time, particularly in the 70s and 80s, to the eviction and expropriation of these neighboring communities, Fanguito, Tokyo, and 22 Abajo. And 30,000 residents were relocated and displaced, leading up to the forming of the G8 and the Land Trust. And so talking with the director of the Land Trust, who is a resident leader, we had the previous experiences of Fanguito, the 22, and Tokyo. These communities' voices were disregarded in these evictions. The communities had no say in these processes. So because of those experiences in the Caño, residents were scared. We had them as recently as the late 70s and early 80s. So whenever these government officials come through, there's always mistrust. So this theme of distrust of government planning processes was felt throughout my discussions, particularly with senior leaders. And it showed in the amount of participation that happened in those first meetings, organizing the G8 and forming the Community Land Trust, where 98% of participating families would come to strongly support the creation of the Land Trust. Intergenerational practices, I focus mostly on the voices of the young folks who participated in LEHAC, which was the critical pedagogy program that draws young people into the movement at young ages through sports and hip hop and art. And these young folks at this point in the movement make up 1/3 of the total volunteers. So the total mobilized active participants in the social movement. It trains them to be critical thinkers and peer facilitators. And youth form critical consciousness and a critical shared voice to help organize and resist the economic impacts of what I refer to as the debt era, which also involved the practices of disaster capitalism after Hurricane Maria. The debt era is, more or less the last 15 to 20 years in Puerto Rico after the 2006 debt crisis that thrust them into 75 or 76 billion of unaudited debt. which has caused detrimental austerity practices, led to the closing of schools, the privatization of the electrical grid, and so on and so forth. These young folks, through these critical pedagogy programs, were exposed to, some of we're offered some of the skills needed to really critically think about their position within the debt era, and also how their interaction with flooding, for example, was impacted by the forces of global capital. So in 2012, an environmental study came out and revealed that Caño children were disproportionately impacted by negative health impacts of flooding, and the young people commonly spoke about how they would have to walk through the water, and how it became just normalized to do so. I'm going to move a little bit more quickly through some of this so we have time to have questions. But again, speaking to the debt era, the 2006 debt crisis also contributed to the Puerto Rican diaspora, to mostly to the United States, where almost 500,000 people left the island over the last 20 years. Hurricane Maria, as many of you I'm sure are aware, left the island of Puerto Rico ravaged, and post Hurricane Maria and Caño Martín Peña, five schools in the community were closed. Across the island, 280 schools were closed. This was felt by a lot of the youth as a turning point, where they were drawn into the movement, where they were thrust into action. And at this time, many young Lihaqueros were charged with an eye-opening and mindset-changing experience, is what I got from many of my interviews. Let's see. This is a report about some of the mobilization efforts that happened post Hurricane Maria by the community, while the U.S. delayed response and had a failed response to Hurricane Maria. Rebuild grants were denied widely to Caño Martín Peña based on the informal status of a lot of their homes. And as I mentioned, 5 schools were closed. Uniquely, those schools sat on community land trust land, and that was an opportunity to use them for multi-use purposes, to develop the Lihac Center, sports facilities, a solidarity store where volunteers could cash in on volunteer hour currency points and buy essential goods for the home, and the new community land trust office. The other notable thing about the young critical voice is that after Maria, in the last 3 years, I believe, they fought to have a voting membership in the G8, and also for youth 14 and older to hold seats on community council boards. This is a really interesting topic to discuss with both elders and the emerging leaders, as this brought some tension into the community, but in the end, the youth were able to win those seats and brought in community participation. So the community control logic of CMP-CLT is civic engagement, represented through community councils, the expansion of critical voice, and the over 30 community initiatives that exist. Land-based organizing based from knowledge formations formulated over generations, as well as participatory planning and the collective struggle for land and family security, transformative organizing, critical pedagogy, intergenerational practices, and then professional support from enlace, and the struggle for government dollars and political power, and international solidarity. There are still many struggles to community control. There are still delays in funds to adequately fulfill the project. To the right here, you can see a group of homes that's being built on land trust land. That's constantly in the works, and there's more dollars needed to fund the relocation project. And other community initiatives have not succeeded, based on often lack of government support, such as the Transformation School project, which was put on hold, and other projects. So looking forward, I think there's a broader research that I plan to do around solidarity and the role of internationalism in the movement, and how the re-enchantment or the reclaiming of the commons must be done through resistance to the concept of the gated commons, which is where community land trusts have boundaries, and it's a great opportunity to protect affordability. But if those land trusts are not part of a broader, bigger movement to challenge predatory capitalism, then there's this root systemic economical problems that will continue to affect and impact working people across the global South. And then this quote, commoning initiatives are more like dikes against the neoliberal assault on our livelihoods. They are seeds, the embryonic form of an alternative mode of production in the make. So CLTs are susceptible to being, again, kind of enclaves, and more deprioritize community control. And so solidarity internationalism is one way that CMP is looking to challenge that. CMP is broadly engaged in international knowledge sharing, particularly with a group in Brazil that's promoting the development of similar CLTs in favelas, and has monthly calls with folks from around the world, has sent delegates to Africa, Ecuador, Brazil, and the US. And this is a demonstration, of how international solidarity is bolstering a level of community control beyond the boundaries of the community land trust. I'm gonna end it there, and I'll end it with one more Federici quote. And here's my email. If folks want to write it down, please reach out anytime. The commons we build should enable us to gain more power with regard to capital and the state, and embryonically prefigure a new mode of production, no longer built on competitive principle, but on the principle of collective solidarity. Okay, thanks for hanging in there. Sorry, I went a bit over time. Hopefully some folks can stick around with questions. Excellent.
Thanks so much, Miles. That's fascinating research, and I think important research, of course, too, obviously. So I do have one question from Jennifer, but she said she had to duck out early. So I'll definitely share that with you. But I wondered for the folks here, if anyone else has. Oh, yes. And Lenny's reminding, please take a moment and fill out a survey. The link is in the chat before you go. We really appreciate that. So does anyone have questions? You can type it in the chat, or you can just jump in. whatever works for you. Well, I can read Jennifer's question, which is a good one. It's a broad one, but an important one, I think. And so she says, thank you. And she wondered what parts of the CMP model do you think could be used elsewhere, kind of more broadly, and maybe what parts are more locally unique to Puerto Rico?
Yeah, I think some things that can be shared and that are being shared are technical components. You know, understanding that in Puerto Rico, the law actually had to change in order to support this kind of land transfer. You know, that's another unique thing about this project, and it's something that cities around the U.S. are also organizers around the U.S. are also pressuring and asking cities to do, is to transfer unused land to community land trusts, or at least offer that land at a lower price. So technical components are there, right? And there's a lot of technical assistance providers that have that knowledge. But I think what can also be transferred is just the embrace of land-based knowledge and community organizing. Now that takes a certain amount of capacity, and what I think includes the promotion of paid community organizers to see that through. But you know, these are communities that share a common struggle. So, you know, that is very unique to this community. But those struggles are happening in informal settlements all over Latin America, where folks are feeling the pressure of being pushed out. So it's pretty unique. It's a lot to ask of a community to take on such a complex and time you know, and deep time investing form of community organizing, but building on the, you know, theories of transformative organizing that centers, you know, critical pedagogy and really looking at locals as the experts in the field, you know, something that you know, can ideally be transferred, you know, anywhere on the planet. And also remembering that land-based organizing centers local knowledge, and so it can take different shapes and different forms depending on the culture or the geography where it's being done.
And that was something that she had mentioned, like that, yeah, culturally you're going to see this variation, obviously, but that broader technical model could be applied elsewhere. Lots more thank yous. Thank you for your valuable research, fascinating presentation. I did have, this is less of a question. You mentioned intergenerational work, or the intergenerationality a bunch, and I just wanted more of a comment. Like, I just found that so impressive, and maybe surprising that was, especially this younger group that made up a third of the, you know, of the organizers. So that was the case. You found a fairly equal split between, you know, across generations in terms of those who were devoted to this work. Is that your takeaway?
Yeah, and I think a lot of that, the emphasis on critical pedagogy with young people, it did also come from some of the professional organizers that came in and had some of the theory tools of, like, Paulo Freire, for example. But it also, that investment in the future generation is also rooted from land-based experiences of just the fact that, you know, folks in this community have been struggling for, you know, 90 years to resist the threats of eviction. So I think there's a common understanding that it's a long haul struggle, and that investing in young people as, like, their most valuable resource is also a succession plan for the long haul ahead.
Nice, thank you. Well, if there aren't more questions, lots of thank yous again. Thank you from me. Thank you from all of us. Lenny, do you have anything to add?
Yes, I have a question. Miles, thank you so much for your presentation. I learned so much, and obviously the topic It's very important for me
Yeah.
growing up in Puerto Rico. My questions for you are in terms more of, did you have any challenge as you were preparing to do this research in Puerto Rico? If you can talk a little bit more, if there were challenges. And also, I'm curious to know, what are you going to do with these findings? So what is the plan? I think it's very important, this work. So I'm curious as to if you're going to publish anything regarding this research. Thank you.
Thanks, Lenny. Yeah, I had many challenges being a new researcher and like a very enthusiastic researcher. I took on way too much. As you can see, I tried to cram a lot just into this presentation. And it's a problem I continue to struggle with. And so I don't know, I guess how I may have done that differently is, ideally just have spent a little bit more time down there earlier on to really hear, and observe and extrapolate what I was hearing from the community that I could then kind of refine into, one or two research questions, right? So I developed my first research questions based on these archives. And that was me, as an outsider, looking at documents and making, assumptions based on those documents. And it was just a ton of information, and it was like very broad and very hard to narrow in. I think when I went down there, I started to hone in a little bit on some of the struggles around community control. And then as I continued to do more research about community land trusts, and granted, this was like right up to my last semester to graduate, is where I started saying, oh, wow, there's this gap in research around community land, around community control. I need to be looking more specifically at this as a contribution to the research. And so in that way, it's like, yeah, in some ways I felt like I did things a little bit backwards, that there were like these gaps in research that, maybe I could have been a little bit more aware of on the front end. And that, again, I did my field research in the summer right before my last semester. And, I wish I had the opportunity to be down in Puerto Rico my second semester, so that I could spend a little bit more time working with the data, from the community, and then taking that information and saying, okay, here are here's the theoretical stuff that I want to dig more deeply into. And then as far as where the project is going, interestingly enough, I feel like I'm still sort of in grad school, because I'm working on a book chapter with the Journal of Latin American Geography, which is affiliated with the Conference of Latin American Geography, CLAG, who were one of my grant sponsors to go down to Puerto Rico. I'm gonna work, I have the support from one of my professors, Patricia Basile, who works in Indiana University. And yeah, it's an exciting project. It's going to be broadly, the book is going to be broadly about territorial struggles in the Americas, and we'll at least have an electronic version that's in 3 languages, Spanish, English, and Portuguese. So yeah, that's happening right now. I'm researching while I'm looking for work in between school and career right now. And it's ongoing. I also took a lot of film, captured a lot of film footage while I was down there, thinking that at some point I might make a video, which is more work, and deserves a little bit more funding and attention, meaning I'm going to be applying for a grant in the next month to try to go back down there, take a little bit more footage, and really set aside the time to put something together.
Thank you so much, and congratulations on the publication.
Thanks, Lenny.
All right, maybe we should wrap up. Is everybody good with that? I think we don't have any more questions. But thank you again so much, Miles, and good luck with, congrats on the chapter and good luck on the job search. And I totally relate to your experience in the field. I'm an archaeologist, so it's totally, but it's the same. Like I did all this stuff and then I got down there and I was like, why didn't I read about this? I think a lot of us have that experience when you're there on the ground doing the actual research. It's totally, that's when those questions come to mind sometimes when you're actually there.
Yep.
So, but it's
Yep.
great research. It's amazing. So great job.
Thank you,
Good luck.
Jessica.
Yeah,
Appreciate
it's great
it.
to meet you.
Thanks, Nader.
All right, thanks everybody. Take care.
Thanks, Katie.
Thank you, Miles.